We are making a very, very strong case that building a new pipeline to Asian markets is in the national interest. We are finding some receptivity on the part of the new Prime Minister, and I would say if we're going to get a deal, it will be in a matter of weeks.
This is a broadside attack on an oil tanker ban that is the foundation of economic growth mapped out for the entire country for the foreseeable future. And it just makes no sense to me that we're not at the table being able to make that case.
Ottawa and Alberta appear close to signing that memorandum of understanding about the energy sector writ large, but also a pipeline proposal. Hurdles there from British Columbia remain, as you heard from the Premier. So how much room is there for compromise? What are the political risks here for Ottawa and for Alberta? Let's bring in our Sunday Scrum, Charelle Evelyn, Managing Editor of the Hill Times, Ryan Tumilty, Toronto Star reporter here in Ottawa, Gary Mason, columnist for the Globe and Mail, and he's in Vancouver. So let's start with you, Gary, because I promised I would, but also because those the comments from Premier Eby are, he takes a very assertive approach that I think largely reflects what a lot of people in British Columbia believe, that tanker ban is a really important thing.
Yeah, I think there's no question that it is, certainly to the people in northern British Columbia, specifically the First Nations along the coast. I think that what's irking Premier Eby the most, maybe not the most, but what's bothering him is that these negotiations seem to be taking place between Alberta and the federal government, and even the government in Saskatchewan seem to be involved in these talks. And British Columbia, over whose land this pipeline would travel and from which coast it would be, the oil would leave from, they're being completely left out of these discussions. And I can't help but think, how Alberta would feel, a province that is so protective of its sovereignty. How would they feel if negotiations were taking place about a project that was going to run across their land, a portion of which a lot of people in First Nations disagree with? I mean, they would be outraged. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not saying that I'm against this pipeline, but the process, I think, leaves a lot to be desired. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of the twinning of the TMX pipeline. British Columbia was against that. They went to court to fight it. It was just all was for naught, and it ended up they ended up getting a pipeline shoved down their throat. And the same thing could happen here. There's no question about it.
It's really unclear to me, Charelle, and obviously we're speculating. That's what we do. But how much of this MOU is about a pipeline, and how much of it is about things that Alberta will commit to doing from a climate perspective in order for a pipeline to be considered. And that's why, I take your point, Gary, but I don't know that the Premier of BC needs to be part of the conversation yet. If it's really about how do you create an energy sector that is prosperous while fighting climate change.
Sure, but then why would the Premier of Saskatchewan need to be involved in that conversation?
It
does come back to that. Yeah. It's like once you start adding other people to the mix, you might as well get everybody involved. Yeah. But I do take the point that yes, this could be an opportunity, an opening for the Prime Minister and the federal government to say to the province of Alberta, okay, you want to do certain things. We want to create a framework that would allow those things to happen. Mm-hmm. What we don't really know, obviously, since we haven't seen the MOU, we don't really know, is this really, about the federal government saying, we are going to do what apparently everybody is asking of us, and that is to get out of the way. Mm-hmm. Even Premier Eby said it the other day. He said, we're not asking for help. We want Ottawa to get out of the way. So is this just the federal government saying, if we lay this groundwork, we tell you what the parameters are, and we throw our hands up and say, it's all up to you. Can you do it in this framework? I mean, it's hard at that point politically to argue and say that Ottawa is stopping us. This is a problem. This is fueling a national unity crisis and so on and so forth, because they've been given either the tools that they need to succeed or the length of rope.
Yeah, and Ryan, is that what this is really about? About sort of removing the political cudgel that the Premier of Alberta has over Ottawa and putting it all in her court?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think, the Carney government is perhaps more on board than the Trudeau government was with seeing the oil sands expand and seeing more production there. But they are, in order to agree to that, they are putting things on the table. And they've actually been fairly clear that, you need to reform Alberta's carbon pricing system. You need to see the Pathways carbon capture project move forward. And if you do some of those things, then maybe they can talk about a pipeline. But I do think, as everyone has said, BC is the last bit here, and someone needs to talk to them. Because, absolutely under constitutional law, BC doesn't have a veto. But trying to build one without their support just guarantees you years of litigation, and that's not what the Alberta government is looking for, I would hope. There also, of course, don't have anyone stepped up to build this pipeline yet. This is a theoretical project at this point.
And I wonder, Gary, how much, whether that might change. That, certainly that's what Jason Kenney said off the top of the show, that the minute you start to remove some of the concerns that private industry has, the more likely it is that a proponent pops up.
Well, yeah, there's no question about that. But where and when that approval is going to come, to me, I just can't see it right now. I mean, I can't see the coastal First Nations, for example, giving their okay to removal of the tanker ban. I mean, personally, I think oil can be shipped out of there safely. I mean, oil is shipped all across the world in waters that are more treacherous than the Hecate Strait. So it can be done with tugboats, and you can take enormous precautions to make sure that the oil gets out of there safely. But, until you have buy-in from the First Nations, I'm not sure that you'll get buy-in from the BC government. So I think it's actually more important to get buy-in from the First Nations. You're still going to scare off potential investors. The other question, Rosemary, that big question is, where is all this money coming from? I mean, the carbon sequestration project alone is like $20 billion. You're talking about a pipeline that's going to cost like probably $40 billion. I mean, there is a lot of money, a lot of unanswered questions. Maybe we'll get some of those questions answered when the memorandum of understanding is detailed. But right now, there's just a lot of unanswered questions.
Charelle, what about the proposal that the Premier of BC put forward and said, listen, you have a pipeline, just expand capacity, use it all, and then look for other opportunities. Jason Kenney said, listen, that would actually get us a little bit further. He would prefer both, I'm sure, but maybe that's the compromise here.
I mean, it could be. David Eby said that the reason that that conversation isn't happening, or is to the degree that this other conversation is happening, he said it's political. It's sure. It's the continued drive of Alberta wanting that political wedge issue about having that additional pipeline, landlocking Alberta's resources, national unity crisis, and so on and so forth. So if that conversation is going to continue to dominate, then, it could very well be that TMX could be expanded, and that could happen, on a dual track, so to speak. But I don't think that it's actually going to, whether or not that expansion does happen, in terms of maximizing the capacity of Trans Mountain, I don't think that it's going to make a real difference in the conversation about a pipeline to the North Coast.
Ryan, how much could this, though, this whatever the MOU is here, how much does it change the relationship between Ottawa, between Alberta and the rest of the country? And is there not an advantage to doing that?
Yeah, absolutely there is. And I think you've already seen Danielle Smith start talking about Ottawa in much more glowing terms than she ever talked about the Trudeau government. And I think there's a way to solve some of these issues. I think the TMX compromise that you raised is a good option. The taxpayer already owns TMX. Why wouldn't we consider this option to make it more productive? Keeping in mind that it's not full at the moment. It hasn't been used to its full capacity yet. So certainly I think there's going to be a lot of questions that the Alberta government is going to have to answer. But I think also if Ottawa doesn't come across as outright refusing and outright hostile to the idea of energy sector expansion, if they put forward an idea of how it can happen inside of our climate change targets, it might actually improve the relationship with Canada in the long run.
I mean, it is remarkable that all of this has happened in, like a year and a bit, that there has been this shift where we're back to talking about another pipeline, whether it happens or not. Charelle Evelyn, Brian Tumilty, Gary Mason, thank you all for spending part of your Sunday with me. I appreciate it. And the former Premier of Alberta, Jason Kenney, joins me now. Nice to see you in person.
Good to be here.
It sounds like we are on the verge of this memorandum of understanding between Ottawa and Alberta as early as Thursday. And it would apparently sort of get the province closer to the idea of a pipeline. How big a deal is this for Alberta?
Well, it's a huge deal for Canada.
Sure.
This is our largest export product by far. We sell $150 billion worth of Canadian crude, primarily from Alberta, every year, which is generates more wealth and more jobs than any other export industry. But we continue to be blocked by egress issues, pipeline issues. And if we got that done and added, let's say, something like 1 million barrels a day, we'd be selling, that would be generating something in the range of $25 billion of additional value, which is probably about $5 billion of taxes and royalties. I mean, that's stuff to build hospitals and stuff. So in an aging population, with the big trade challenges coming from south of the border, I think we have to do things like this, and I'm glad to hear there's progress being made on it.
It does sound as though the big hurdle will be, of course, British Columbia. First Nations on the coast have issues with the idea of another pipeline. The Premier is very upset that he has not been included in these conversations, doesn't like the idea that a tanker ban may be lifted or exempt for some sort of future project. What do you make of the hurdle that is British Columbia? Those are real concerns they have.
Well, in due course, if there is a specific project that applies for a permit from the National Energy Regulator, the British Columbia government would have every right to make its representations at the time, to express its concerns. But David Eby, frankly, I'm surprised he's a lawyer. He was the Attorney General who got absolutely humiliated when he tried to stop the Trans Mountain expansion. He had he passed a law to say BC could regulate an interprovincial pipeline. The BC Appeal Court unanimously said, no, you can't. No. This is a federal, exclusive federal jurisdiction, upheld unanimously by the Supreme Court of Canada. So I would say to Mr. Eby, do you believe in the Constitution and the rule of law or not? And are you on Team Canada or not? Because all of this this whinging that he's doing is it's out of bounds. It's unconstitutional. BC cannot stop interprovincial infrastructure like this.
They can't stop it, but they can certainly raise their concerns around it, and that is what he's doing. And he hasn't been consulted. So,
well, listen. Why doesn't he consult British Columbians? Every poll I've seen in the last year indicates a significant majority of British Columbians support this. And by the way, on First Nations. I don't buy the notion that there's a widespread opposition. When that was actually tested on the Trans Mountain expansion, the Supreme Court upheld a trial court finding that 111 of 119 Indigenous communities that had some putative interest were either supportive or neutral, and ultimately got built, as you saw, with very limited actual resistance. Same with Coastal GasLink. We heard a lot of noise about a couple of allegedly hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en. It got built with the support of every elected council there. And so what we have found is, as long as there's equity participation available to Indigenous communities, I have seen overwhelming support amongst Western Canadian First Nations for projects like this.
Okay, what about the idea of just increasing the Trans Mountain pipeline? That is something that the Premier Eby does support, and there is additional capacity there.
Sure, I would take a both-and approach, but I do hope that they can focus on that as a constructive point of agreement without allowing the dispute over a potential Northwest pipeline to disrupt it. You could, the Trans Mountain Company, which is a Crown corporation, federal corporation, could expand by upwards of 300,000 barrels a day, shipments down to the Port of Vancouver, dredge the harbor, which means more capacity loaded into the tankers that come out of there safely. That would be really helpful. And Enbridge has some proposals to optimize their pipeline network that could also increase shipments. Mm-hmm. And I'm an advocate of finishing the Keystone XL project. It's no longer KXL technically, but gets Trump to buy into additional Canadian exports. It would be a lot simpler and a lot cheaper to get that done, probably a lot more quickly as well.
In order for this agreement to go forward, there are things that Alberta will have to do around carbon capture and storage, around emissions. Is this kind of the Prime Minister's attempt to put the ball in Alberta's court and say, if you really want to do this, let's get you to commit to some movement on that front?
Well, I think that probably reflects his view, the federal government's view, and I think Alberta would say, welcome to the party. We were the first subnational jurisdiction, or the first jurisdiction in North America with an industrial price on carbon emissions, and Ralph Klein did that in 2005. And we used those resources in part to pay for the first large-scale CCUS, carbon sequestration projects in Canada, including the carbon trunk line that's taking sequestered CO2 off of refineries in the Edmonton refinery complex and injecting that into central Alberta, into the sedimentary basin there. So you've got this stuff that's already happening thanks to Alberta and industry leadership. Pathways has been leaning forward on this. So in principle, I think an agreement is possible there, as long as the cost is reasonable. Because if only the Canadian industry is having to pay for tens of billions of dollars of carbon sequestration infrastructure, and their competitors from Saudi Arabia to Russia to Texas are not, then we're at a huge global disadvantage.
Is a pipeline, do you think it's likely, given what we were just talking about in terms of capacity and increased capacity and other options? Another pipeline, is it likely? It's possible. I would say a new Northwest Coast pipeline is going to be hard to do. But if we get the right policy environment, lifting the emissions cap and the tanker ban and so forth, I think a proponent will come forward because the value is just enormous. Once you're shipping that amount of energy, you're talking over its lifetime about hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue being generated. That spins off tolls that easily pays for the infrastructure over time. Okay. Jason Kenney, nice to see you. The potential pipeline project, of course, has opposition, as we've been talking about, notably from some First Nations. The Coastal First Nations is an alliance of 8 First Nations that live along BC's northern and central coast, and they've spoken out against Smith's project. Earlier this month, the group, along with BC Premier David Eby, signed a declaration doubling down on the support for an oil tanker ban that is currently in place and opposition to any sorts of exceptions or carve-outs. Joining me now is the president of the Coastal First Nations and elected chief of the Heiltsuk First Nation, one of the 8 First Nations that make up that group. Marilyn Slett, nice to see you.
Good morning.
Tell us why you are opposed to this idea.
We've been very clear that we don't support this project. We've called upon the federal government to uphold the tanker ban. Our position is not a new position. It's been in place for many decades. And this is our home. We rely upon a healthy ocean to sustain our way of life, and adding oil tankers to this is just not something that we can support.
Danielle Smith and the Prime Minister and sort of their counterparts, people around them, have been in these negotiations for some time. You told CBC News, I understand, that you haven't heard from anyone, really. The Prime Minister, the Energy Minister, I don't know if anyone has reached out to you, that you heard from an Alberta representative that was weeks ago. So what is your reaction to the fact that these conversations are happening without you at this stage anyway?
Yeah, it's incredibly alarming to wake up and read about or hear about things through the media, and this is how it has been for the past few months. Reading about these proposed discussions and creating pathways for a project that has significant impacts on our communities.
Do you really think that this is a possibility, given that, well, first of all, your opposition to it, which will be considered, BC Premier's opposition to it? Do you think that these are hurdles that the Alberta Premier can actually overcome?
Well, our position has been clear from the beginning, and we've spent decades protecting the ocean and the natural environment around us. So that is not going to stop. With these proposed discussions and proposed MOUs. We will continue in this in this way, for as long as we are here. So no, it's not something that we can, support. And honestly, we don't hope that, the Canadian government will uphold, their duty to talk to us, to duty of the Crown. There's so many, factors involved here. So,
Marilyn Slett, tell me why the tanker ban was such an important piece of legislation that the previous government put in place, that formalizing this ban, and why it matters so much to communities there.
Sure. I was reading some of the West Coast oil port inquiries that happened along the coast, including in Heiltsuk Territory and Namu. A couple of my uncles were providing testimony there, and an elder from our community, and this was in 1977. And he spoke about the industrialization and the resource extraction that was really building, in his lifetime. And he talked about an oil spill, and he said that this would, finish us. This would finish our community, our nation. And, our community ourselves, the Heiltsuk Nation has had an oil spill here in the territory in 2016 with the Nathan E. Stewart. So it's not an abstract thing for us. We're, living with the impacts of that spill today.
What would you hope that the Prime Minister and the Premier are considering as they reach this agreement that we'll understand the details of later this week?
Well, we're rights and title holders of these communities along the central, north, and Haida Gwaii coastline. And, we aren't going anywhere, to find other opportunities. This is our home. And, we've spent many years working with both the provincial and federal governments on, protection measures. So we would hope that, we can continue to do that work together, and that Canada would uphold the oil tanker moratorium in its entirety. It is not an oil tanker ban if they start making exceptions to it.
Marilyn Slett, President of the Coastal First Nations, thank you for getting up early for us this morning. Appreciate your time. For more on what the agreement might look like and the challenges that remain, we're joined by Dennis McConaghy. He's a former energy executive at TransCanada Corporation. Nice to see you this morning.
Good morning.
It's so this deal, it looks like it's going to come as early as a little bit later this week. How do you feel about the fact that we are in this place where there is going to be some sort of formal agreement between Ottawa and Alberta?
Well, as I've said for several weeks, I still have some skepticism that they actually get to the finish line. And secondly, the devil is very much in these details. But just let me make these comments in respect of this MOU. Alberta's real objective is to have a policy environment that makes the possibility of an incremental 1 million barrels of crude oil production over the next decade happen. So the three elements that are supposed to be in this MOU, one relates to a tanker ban, workaround, carve out. That is applicable if the way that some of this incremental production will move will be through the West Coast. The fundamental argument for going there has always been the potential for higher netbacks. However, the other two elements are just as fundamental, and they apply to all other incremental infrastructure possibilities for Alberta's incremental crude oil, whether that's the TMX expansion of existing systems, notably Enbridge, or a revival of KXL. And those relate to the removal of fundamental elements of current Canadian carbon policy, such as emission caps, mandates for decarbonization. So those are really fundamental reversals of longstanding Canadian climate policy. So if they in fact get a deal by the end of next week, it could be very profound, even more profound than just a workaround on the tanker ban.
Well, so let's assume some of these concerns that you're talking about are going to be dealt with. Certainly, it seems like the emissions cap is something the government recognizes needs to be put aside, although there will still be an industrial carbon price. What is the likelihood if those things are removed that a private proponent will emerge? Do you think that is possible?
Well, remember, the first investment decision that really has to come about is being satisfied that a removal of emission caps isn't nullified by an impossibly high carbon price applied to any of the emissions applied. So there's a lot of specifics that have to be sorted out, because you can't have a carbon price that makes incremental production uncompetitive. The same point applies to constraint on decarbonization. If there is a signal that incremental investment will be made by the 4 or 5 major oil sands producers, they're going to have to find solutions to get it to move. And I'm confident that they will optimize that. That may or may not mean a pipeline to the BC coast, but the goal of higher netbacks and optionality is a driving force. But as the Premier of BC has pointed out, there are other options, one of which might be an expansion of TMX, although there are fundamental marine reasons why larger scale tankers in the BC ports of Kitimat and Prince Rupert could be desirable. So to the specifics, like whatever this workaround on an industrial carbon price, it can't be so high as to be punitive. So that's one of the real things we're going to all look at. And likewise, if you're going to impose CCS or decarbonization on incremental production, that again begs the question of it won't be competitive and Canada will lose this opportunity. So there's a lot to really see how committed Mark Carney is to realizing that ambition of an extra 1 million barrels of Canadian oil production, which would actually put us potentially as high as 3rd in the world in world oil producers.
CCS, of course, carbon capture and storage. So you mentioned there that the BC Premier, who is not in favor of, for instance, the tanker ban changing, that is obviously the concern for BC coastal nations, First Nations, posed to that as well. The idea that perhaps what will happen is to increase the capacity on TMX. Would that be enough to change the situation and help the oil sands and help Alberta in terms of extraction? Would that meet the bar, I guess, is what I'm asking?
Well, as I said before, I think there's a possibility that an alternative to going to Kitimat or Prince Rupert, by some combination of expansion of existing systems, one of which is TMX, could be viable, or a revival of KXL. However, as I've said before, if you do that, you lose some of the optionality that you would gain by going to those other 2 ports in terms of more significant allocation of that oil to potentially Asian markets. So strategically, there's always been a significant goal of getting a large-scale pipe to those 2 ports. In fact, we did have one almost 15 years ago or 12 years ago in the Northern Gateway project that Pierre Trudeau somewhat capriciously said no to.
Justin Trudeau. Let me end on this.
Yes.
Yeah, let me end on this. Is this,
Thank you.
Do you think, the beginning of a different relationship between Alberta and Ottawa, though?
I think this is fair to say that this is a real statement of where Mark Carney comes down in terms of trying to seize significant private sector capital investment to actually add real GDP to this economy, or how much existing climate-related policy and orthodoxy are going to continue to constrain this. I think this is like a really pivotal moment and statement for the Carney government. I think we can all agree on that point.
Okay, Dennis McConaghy, former energy executive at TransCanada Corporation. Thank you for making the time this morning, sir.
Thank you.